Katie, what did Mark Carney need to accomplish here?
The simple answer is do no harm and really make sure that he doesn't have additional challenges to deal with that he didn't have before the summit started. And there's a couple of lenses you can sort of look at that through. So from the Canada-U.S. perspective, are there new problems that Mark Carney needs to deal with? Not that we're aware of. They have this new 30-day deadline meant to sort of spark those conversations along. So that seems to be moving along okay. It doesn't seem there's any new fresh harm there. But then when you take a step back and look at the broader aspect of this summit, is there harm in the fact that these G7 leaders couldn't come together on some of the most critical issues that are affecting the world right now?
Okay, so why don't we take a look at some of the things the Prime Minister's office has said that Canada accomplished here. So we are looking at a discussion about critical minerals and AI, that was with the French president, a plan to sign a shared security agreement with the Japanese Prime Minister, discussion to expand the Canada-EU free trade relationship, and $4.3 billion in support for Ukraine. So, Murray, can we pick up on the Ukraine funding there and Carney's meeting with President Zelensky? How significant is that amount of money?
Well, $4.3 billion is nothing to sneeze at. And we've got the normal military funding, but we also have something interesting in the sense that the Ukrainians are now going to get a $2.3 billion loan using the interest from frozen Russian assets. More sanctions, which is what Volodymyr Zelensky was asking for when he came here earlier today. But significantly, and this is the part that jumps out at me, was the attempt to sanction Russia's shadow tanker fleet. That's very significant because it is becoming a major concern for the Europeans who have been talking about possibly seizing those vessels. And so the other aspect to the Ukraine relationship was they were looking for some kind of consensus for a strong statement. And the Prime Minister, during his news conference, danced around that. And, there was suggestions that the U.S. watered down the attempts and they put it in the chair, but there was no separate statement for Ukraine, which is significant, and I'm sure it's something the Ukrainians are going to notice.
Absolutely. In terms of the United States, Katie, the big announcement here, right, is this 30-day deadline to reach a trade and security deal. Mark Carney said tonight that having a deadline is helpful to focus negotiations. You have covered a lot of trade negotiations. Is that deadline a real thing?
So what Mark Carney said tonight is very much in line with what we reported earlier today. And the sources have told myself, as well as my colleagues at Radio Canada, that the Canadians want this 30-day deadline as a way to sort of try to force the Americans to get serious about the negotiations. What we are hearing is that the Canadians, and this is according to senior Canadian government sources, is that the Canadians are coming to the table. They're making these specific offers with specific proposals. They are generally received well by the Americans, but that the Americans aren't sort of responding in kind. They're not coming back with their own proposals. And so the Canadians really want to try and force things, put a sense of urgency in there. And with this make or break deadline for this, they hope it can sort of jumpstart things to get toward a finish line.
Okay, well, I mean, we'll see on that. At the very end of the closing news conference, Mark Carney sort of held the room of reporters back a little bit to add a thought, I suppose a bit of a defense of the G7. We have that. Why don't we take a listen?
There is a great amount of direct dialogue and discussion, very frank exchanges, very strategic exchanges, differences of opinion on a number of issues, but from an effort to find common solutions to some of these problems. And that is particularly valuable, in my opinion.
So he added something interesting there, that multilateralism is under great strain, if you will. So Murray, curious, as the United States sort of recedes in a way, is the G7 and I suppose other bodies like it more important to other countries?
Well, G7 is under strain. There's the United States only stuck around for half of the summit, and multilateralism is not dead. It is under strain, but multilateralism only works if the United States is rowing with its allies at the same time, and perhaps not even rowing against it. So this is the thing I think that we all have to watch coming out of this particular summit, is how the allied nations get together, perhaps in smaller groups, and try to move the ball forward on key issues such as Ukraine. how much progress they're going to make without the backing of the United States is really up in the air. And I mean, there have been papers and international experts who've suggested that maybe it's time to reform the G7 into something like the G6 without the United States, which is something that a lot of people, particularly in the institutions of the different governments, are opposed to. They still find that it's important to try and find common ground with the United States.
So, we have been talking about Donald Trump leaving early. What's your sense, just listening to what Murray's saying, about how important others perceive the United States to be? How important do you think Donald Trump perceives the G7 to be?
The attitude coming from the White House is it's America first, baby, and nothing else really matters. And that is the attitude that sort of shapes all of the foreign policy decisions, all of the economic divisions, and Donald Trump views himself as a disruptor. And all of this is in line with how the White House is trying to reshape the way the world works to make it more favorable for terms for America. We've seen it a lot when it comes to trade, and we're seeing it a lot now when it comes to support for institutions and the United States feeling it's done too much for too long, not enough people have kept up, and they want that to change. And so all of this sort of speaks to the fact that this is a Donald Trump America First agenda. They are not apologetic for it, and they are pushing ahead and want to see further change. The question is, are these other G7 countries, all of these other countries that are allies of the United States that work together to try and row in the same direction and try to achieve common outcomes, are they going to get in line with the United States? Because they're going to row in one direction, and it's up to everyone else to get in line.
Well, they're going to have a chance to talk pretty soon, right? There's this NATO conference coming up next week. This one's done. NATO is next. After Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada will meet its defense spending target soon, what do you think, Murray, we should be watching for at that NATO summit?
Well, the debate is going to be about 5%. Canada's going to come into the room and say, hey, we've made 2%. And now the benchmark is going to be 3.5 for military spending and 1.5 for defense infrastructure. So it's going to be interesting to see how that debate goes with among allies, but also among Canadian officials, because it's been a struggle to get to 2%.
Right. And now the bar is moving. All right, Murray, Katie, as always, thanks very much, you two.
Thanks.
Welcome.